All right, let's go ahead and get started. So hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for coming today to our second session. This one is, we're going to introduce the SIRS instead of the CARS, which is code name for sciences. But nobody ever heard of what the SIRS are, and that's what I want to hope to elucidate today. My name is Doug McLemore. I'm a staff advisor and the test prep specialist for the HPA. And without further ado, let's get on to introducing the MCAT science sections. So the first thing I want to review for those of you who were here before and those of you who weren't here before, you'll be seeing this for the first time, is the structure of the MCAT. So I'm going to do this in the form of a pop quiz. So what's the first thing you run into when you see the MCAT exam, when you first start it? The optional tutorial. Yes. Should you do the optional tutorial? Yes, it's a good thing to do because it gives you some time to get settled into your seat, arrange your chair, arrange your mouse, your monitor, and all that fun stuff. So it is something that I don't consider optional. You shouldn't be doing it for the tutorial because at this point, you should have taken enough practice tests that you understand how the test is actually going to work. Then comes the Chem Phys section. So how many questions do we see in a science section? You get 95 minutes to do. How many questions? Well, that would be 59. We'll see that in more detail, but 59 questions in 95 minutes. That's the nice, easy way to remember that. It's a mnemonic way. And do we remember what subjects will we see in the Chem Phys section? GChem, OChem, yes. What else will we see on this section? Physics, biochem, yes. And one other subject that's on almost every section of the test, since this is a medical related test. Biology, yes, biology. You're going to see biology, GChem, OChem, biochem, and physics on this section of the test. It is the most, I would say, diverse section. You'll see a lot of cross-pollination of topics. You'll see a physics passage that has some GChem and biochem questions in it potentially, or a bio passage, or well, actually, we'll see a bio passage, but a OChem passage has some biochem and GChem in it. This is where they start to combine stuff together. Next up is the 10-minute optional break. What is one of the most important things you can do during said optional break? Go to the bathroom. Yes, that is correct. Because you don't want to be caught in the middle of the next section with your legs crossed going, look, man, I wish I had gone to the bathroom. So while you can actually get up from the middle of the section and go to the bathroom, the clock does not stop. So use these optional breaks and try to. You don't want to be like parents, you're like in the car when your parents said, you should have thought about that before we left home. So you want to make sure you're doing that right now. What is the next section, in fact? Cars, and we get 90 minutes to do. How many questions in cars? Anybody remember how many questions there were? It's not 59, it's less. 53 questions in 90 minutes. Or how many passages? This one's the easy one. If you got 90 minutes, you have 10 minutes of passage. How many passages is that? 9 passages. That is correct. Nice, easy MCAT math there. Then comes the optional break / lunch. You definitely should take the lunch. What 2 macronutrients are probably the smart ones to have during the optional break / lunch? That you do want to eat something, although you don't want to eat a full meal. Protein is a big one, and not just any carbs, but simple or complex. Complex carbs, because you don't want the sugar crash that comes from having lots of simple carbs. Eating Twinkies, not a good idea during the lunch. Eating things with a lot of protein like fruits and nuts and a lot of complex carbs like, I don't even know. I don't eat complex carbs. I love my bread. That is definitely not complex carbs. But anyways, I digress. Then comes the biochem section, which includes what subjects are the subjects in the biochem section? Don't think too hard, tumor right in the name. Bio and biochem. In addition, you will also see two other chems. What are they? G-chem and O-chem. So you will see a lot of chemistry and a lot of biology. I would say about a 50-50 mix of biochem or biology versus biochem, G-chem, O-chem. Sorry about that. I'll say that one more time. You have about a 50-50 mix of biology and of chemistry, bio, O-chem, G-chem. Those three is 50% of it. Then another break, and then the psych-soc section, which what subject is surprising here? What subject besides psychology and sociology will you see on the psych-soc section? Biology, once again, you see biology on every single section of this test. Holy cow. Yes, that is what they do. Then finally, you get the void question. What is one good reason out of the two I gave you that you should ever use the void question? Because most of the time, the void question is simply temptation. You guys are doing good with my pop quiz so far. If there's a weird power outage, or you're not just sick, but like uber sick, where things are just doing things in your body that shouldn't be doing stuff. So really, that's it. And then the truly optional thing, in my opinion, the optional survey, then you just get going home or whatever your post MCAT partying is going to look like. So that's the structure of the MCAT. Make sure you're familiar with that. And honestly, it's good. Like, you should be able to give this presentation of how the test should go. You should be that familiar with the structure of it, so you're not missing anything. You're not surprised by anything when you get there. Now, what are the scientific inquiry and reasoning skills? These are actually these things that the MCAT expects of you. They're similar to the CARs. They're similar to the critical analysis and reasoning skills. The same number is in the Chem Phys section, but we're going to cover that in just a second in more detail. So the SIRS are to the sciences as the CARs are to reading comprehension. They're basically splitting up the tasks that they're asking you to accomplish in the different questions. So the second most common type of these is just simply knowledge of scientific concepts and principles, which in their minds is contributing to your understanding of scientific concepts and whether you understand relationships and can identify those relationships. And these are what I like to call your memory questions, because literally these things are coming straight out of your brain, right? This is the content part of it. But here's what I want to emphasize. When you're studying for the MCAT, what is it that people tend to want to focus upon? Doing practice problems or doing content review? What is that thing that people generally want to do when studying for an MCAT? Yeah, content review. People most of the time will want to focus on the content review because that's what you know and that's what you're comfortable with. And it's what makes you feel like you're making progress, because if I just know more content, then I can answer more questions. Something I want to point out: what percentage of the questions on the sections, all the science sections, is content, pure memorized content? What percentage is pure memorized content on each science section? It's on the screen already. 35%. About 1/3 of it is scientific content. Now, if you take the whole test into comparison, 1/3 of all the science sections and 0% of the cars sections yields a test where memorized content will only help you directly on 25% of the questions, give or take. Now, I want that to sink in. 25% of the questions, your pure knowledge will help you with in a direct fashion. That is a lot or not a lot? That's tiny. That's teeny tiny. As far as that goes, that's a mere pittance in the whole grand scheme of things. So what does this tell you about your content review? Should it be the bulk of what you're doing, or should it be about 25 to 33% of what you're doing? You should be defaulting to about 25% to 33% of your time should go towards the actual content review. And that is surprising to a lot of people. Like it's anathema to what you as an undergrad have been taught, that if you just know more facts, know more stuff, that you'll be able to do better at the test. And this is just like, I'm just putting the math to it, because here's the problem. 45% of the questions on all the science sections are scientific reasoning and problem solving. Reasoning about scientific principles, theories, and models, analyzing and evaluating scientific explanations and predictions. This is taking the information they wrote about and taking it to the next step. So they're testing your reasoning rather than your knowledge. Now, knowledge will help you a little bit here. I won't say that if you know stuff, it's not going to help. The problem is you can't know everything, and you're always going to run into something you don't know, which means you have to take what's on the page. Sorry. There's just so much going on outside my house right now. So you have to take what's on the page and you have to do something with it. So it's really important that you do, in addition to the content review, you do a lot of practice problems, because these are the types of questions, which is the bulk of the questions, by the way, plus these other two SIRS, which is reasoning about design and execution of research, as well as data-based and statistical reasoning, which is basically all the other things involved in analyzing the figures, analyzing the experimental design. That's the bulk of the section. That's 65% of it, more than half of the test. In fact, more like 3/4 of the test overall is going to be taking what you're given and doing something with it. Whew. So it's very lopsided. So hopefully that is a little bit of a shock to the system, a little bit of surprise, to tell you that watching videos and reading books will only get you so far. In fact, I find that people that do that will plateau in their score. If you find yourself plateauing, it's because you're probably not doing enough practice. Do more practice problems rather than do more reading, because you learn by making mistakes. How many people here jumped on their bicycle the first time and just rode it perfectly? Well, you didn't. So what happened? How'd you learn how to ride a bike? You had to practice. And in practicing, you made mistakes. We learn from the mistakes we make. So you have to humble yourself a little bit when studying for the MCAT. Are you going to make mistakes? Yes. Is it okay that you make mistakes? Heck yeah. Oh my gosh. In the reality of science, what I learned from being a chemist was that, what would you guess? Number of experiments that are successful in a lab environment. 100%, 90%, 50%, 10%. Right? 10%. If that, if 10%, it's usually even lower than that. Most of the time in a laboratory environment, in experimental environment, you're making mistakes, and that's how we learn. So that's my point. Do practice, make mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes. You should be proud of making mistakes, because you want to just proudly make that mistake. You're like, yeah, I answered that. Yep, I sure did. And then go and figure out why you made a mistake. Figure out what was flawed with your logic. And that's how you get better. So what sciences are tested? Let's focus in on this a little bit more. So on the Chem Phys and the Biochem, they will test you on biochemistry. Both of the sections have that. And I highlighted a couple things as being topics that you'll see more often than others. Not saying you will not see metabolism, not saying you won't see protein trafficking. It's just you'll see enzyme kinetics, things like Michaelis-Menten kinetics, when inhibition like the different types of inhibition, that kind of stuff comes up very regularly. Central dogma. What do I mean by the central dogma? Replication, transcription, translation. That kind of idea that you have a one-directional only path through it. That also tends to get asked about more often than the other stuff. It's very common. You see some very regularly occurring questions when it comes to that. They particularly like to trip you up by mixing up translation and transcription in their descriptions of them. Be notable there. Now, does that mean you don't need to understand protein trafficking or metabolism? You've got to understand that. It's just that you're going to see enzyme kinetics and central dogma have some repeated things that they hit again and again and again and again. General chemistry, you're going to see on Chem Phys and Biochem as well. Again, you don't see every subject equally, but there's three biggies. What is IMF? Yes, intermolecular forces. What is the strongest of the intermolecular forces? Hydrogen bonding? Agree or disagree? There could be some disagreement here. I would say that's very, very strong. There's one that's stronger, and this is something that a lot of people don't remember from class, is that if I involve a ion in my intermolecular forces, is that stronger or weaker than a hydrogen bond? Like say ion dipole or an ionic bond. That is much, much, much stronger, and it comes from the same place. So if there's one thing I can teach you right now, content-wise, it's that you should be thinking of ionic bonds as the strongest of the intermolecular forces, followed closely by hydrogen bonds, but ionic bonds they're really strong. What's the weakest of the intermolecular forces? London dispersion forces. I'm glad I did not see this answer. We should not see this answer. This answer is bad. That is van der Waals forces. Because what is IMF? IMF is van der Waals forces. Van der Waals forces is IMF. But London dispersion forces is the weakest of those van der Waals forces. Kinetics versus equilibrium, another thing they compare a lot. They like you to know rate laws. They like you to know equilibrium constants, things like that. But there's a big distinction between the two. Can a kinetics question have an equilibrium answer? Can a kinetics question have an equilibrium answer? Be willing to be wrong. Everybody proffer an answer, even if you think you're wrong. It's okay. You can even hide it by putting it direct to me. Can a kinetics question have an equilibrium answer? Anyone else want to give a guess? We're saying yes? Absolutely not. This is a big, big rift between kinetics and thermo, because equilibrium and thermo are same. They're the same thing. Kinetics questions can't have an equilibrium or thermodynamic answer. Thermodynamic or equilibrium questions can't have a kinetics answer. The only thing that crosses that KT boundary, as I like to call it, kinetics thermodynamics boundary, is temperature. There's a big rift between kinetics and thermodynamics, a big rift between kinetics and equilibrium. Again, if there's one thing I can teach you about that today, that's the one thing. Then, of course, acids and bases, because acids and bases are ubiquitous in biology, biochemistry, organic chemistry. Heck, if there's a way to put it into physics, I'm sure they'll find a way, because acids and bases are so important. And if there's one thing I can tell you about acids and bases, is that you should just memorize a list of weak acids and weak bases. The biggest problem I see with acids and bases is most people can't recognize an acid or base when they're looking at it. So work on that. Memorize those weak acids and weak bases. Organic chemistry, this one's a surprise for a lot of people when I tell you what you need to know. Yeah, I've got properties, reactions, and mechanisms, but that isn't the most important thing. Really, it's your ability to determine if things are isomers of one another, and it's your knowledge of the lab techniques, organic lab techniques, like, you know, HPLC, different types of chromatography, NMR, IR. That stuff's far more prevalent than the nomenclature, properties of molecules, and reactions and mechanisms. And the other thing about reactions and mechanisms here is you don't need to know a lot of them. You do not need to know alkene reactions. You do not need to know alkyne reactions. You do not need to know benzene reactions. You do not need to know, what's it called? Diels-Alder reactions. You do not need to know cycloaddition reactions. You do not need to know radical reactions. Like 80% of what you learn in organic chemistry, throw it out the window. You only need SN1, SN2, E1, E2, as well as the carbonyl reactions. That is it. Does that surprise anybody? It really sucks that you guys are, as a pre-med, you're forced to take 118 instead of 8. You really only need 8 for the MCAT, but you're still forced to take 118. Can't do nothing about that. That's what the med schools want at this point. Although I know the American Chemical Society is fighting for you guys. They're trying to convince the AAMC that that really is a bad class for you guys to be in. Unfortunately, it doesn't help you guys. But you can make fun of the OChem, that the DAT and OAT friends that you have, the ones that are taking that test. You can laugh at them because they got to know all that stuff. Physics, work and energy, light and sound, fluids. Why do you think those are the big topics on the MCAT for physics? Biological systems, heck yeah. That's where you're going to see the biggest crossover of biology with physics. Light and sound, eyes and ears, fluids, the circulatory system, the lungs, hydrostatics in your cells, work energy, like converting one form of energy to another form of energy to do useful work. I mean, that is really what physics and biology is. Forces to some extent, circuits to some extent come up. Kinematics is actually one that I put it in gray because it's not as important. Kinematics being things like rate or velocity, acceleration, all that kind of fun stuff. It's pretty hard to make one of those into a biology question. It gets done once in a while, but it's pretty hard to make like a projectile motion question. Other than say maybe somebody projectile vomiting, I can't find an easy way to make that a biology topic. Pretty difficult to do that. When it comes to biology, again, we see another surprising thing. What thing do I have grayed out here? Anatomy. What? Don't you need to take anatomy to be ready for med school? Absolutely not. In fact, contrary to popular belief, anatomy is not a prerequisite for med schools. I think there's like a couple out there, and they're like creme de la creme schools. But like, yeah, anatomy, you don't need that for the MCAT nor med school. They're going to teach you all the anatomy you need to know. Now, is it a fun class to take? Sure. I took it because it was a really cool class. Like, gross anatomy is great. And the fact that that's the only anatomy we have here at Davis is gross is really weird. But yeah, it's kind of a cool class. But do not think that if you don't take anatomy, you won't be ready for the MCAT. You will be. The more important topic is physiology. They love to talk about how systems work and how systems interact, like how hormones trigger this and how concentration of this ion triggers that and how this affects that. It's more about the physiology than the anatomy. Microbiology, also very, very prevalent. They love you to know the difference between viruses, the difference between different types of bacteria. They're always asking about eukaryotes versus prokaryotes, being able to know those differences. I was on the fence with genetics of making it bold. Where genetics you're gonna see on the test, but not very many questions, and it's almost always the same kind of question. It's almost always going to be either a Punnett square or it's going to be a pedigree. They started putting pedigrees back on the test. They took them away for a while, but the pedigrees are back. Oh, I hate pedigrees. You got to remember what circles and squares mean and all that stuff. Psychology, perception, and behavior by leaps and bounds are going to be far more prevalent than the self-identity type stuff from psychology. Perception, because why? How does perception play into this bio-heavy test? How do I get things in my brain to perceive them in the first place? The senses, and things are routed to different parts of the brain and neurobiology. Yeah, totally. Eyes and ears are really the senses they deal with almost exclusively on the MCAT, but that's their way to sneak biology into the psych-soc. And then behavior, they like to focus on it, like social disorders or development of personality. That kind of stuff is in there. They love their dead guys, man. They will call out theories by name, and they will ask you for what is the theory, the scientist that came up with that. So there's a lot of memorization in the psychology. You'll have a lot of this guy would most likely agree with, like Freud would most likely agree with which of the following descriptions of whatever happened. So you do need to know the people's names and the names of the theories in the psych-soc section. Unfortunately, I find that abysmal, so I hate memorizing that stuff. The sociology, really, it's less about culture, more about social structure. They will get into some ethical things when it comes into social structure. Ethics didn't used to be a concern on the MCAT. Now it is a concern on the MCAT, so you need to be aware of that. So what's the easiest way, what's the best way to determine if something is a pathogen? What's the easiest and best way to determine if something is a pathogen? No ideas? How did the guy discover that what is the H. pylori causes ulcers? How did he discover that? Oh my goodness. This is a great story about, yeah, totally. He tested it on himself. You guys should know this story, by the way. The scientist that discovered H. pylori causes ulcers tested it on himself. He ingested it. Now, the best way to test it would have been testing it on somebody else. And but is that ethical to test it on somebody else? Just infect somebody with a pathogen. Is that an ethical thing to do? Absolutely not. You better not be testing on random people like that. So the best way is not necessarily the correct way on the MCAT, because you have to think of ethics. And that particularly comes up in the social section, because they're often talking about experimental design in this section, more so than the other sections. Now, what is the timing on this section of the test? You got 95 minutes to do 59 questions total. That's broken up into 10 passages of 4, 5, or 6 questions. The most common are going to be 4. You're going to have probably 6 passages with 4 questions, 3 passages with 5 questions, and 1 passage with 6. Pretty much it's broken down like that since they made the change. And 15 of the questions will be discrete, and they always come after the same sections. They come after section 2, 4, or 2, 5, 8, and 10. 2, 5, 8, and 10. Or maybe 2, 5, 7, 10. I'll check on that for next time to make sure I verify that. But they always come after the same sections. So 59 questions total. Timing wise, for the discrete questions, you should be running about 1.5 minutes a question. The discrete ones being ones that are not associated with the passage. So if you're spending more than 2.5 minutes on a question, or 1.5 minutes on a question, that's too much time on average. The passages, you only really have about 7 minutes to answer a 4-question passage. So if we're saying it's 1.5 minutes per question, so that's 4 questions, that's 6 minutes. How many minutes to investigate the passage do I have? Minute and a half a question. How many minutes am I spending on the passage itself if I'm doing 7 minutes a passage? Little more MCAT math for you. What? 1 minute? Yes, 1 minute. You have 1 minute to get through the science passages. Should you really be reading the science passages, given the timing on the science section? No, you don't have time, guys. There's not enough time to read these things in detail. You got to let go of that. You got to be looking at these passages for like, what's important here, what's important here, what's important here, moving on. You don't get points for reading passages. What do you get points for? Answering questions. You need to spend time on the questions, not reading passages. And in the sciences, there's also this thing that happens where there's a couple questions a passage which don't even use the passage itself. It is silly to read all of the passages in detail, especially. You should use them, but you shouldn't read them. You got to get good at scanning and finding details. And that's a transition that a lot of people have a problem with, because you think it's going in there like cars. Don't do the cars thing hard. 5-question passages, 7.5 minutes. That 6-question passage should cap out at 8 minutes. You shouldn't be spending more than 8 minutes on that 6-question passage. Whew, that's fast paced on the passage side. But like I said, you don't get points for reading, you get points for answering questions. So that's what you should focus your attention on. Now, what are the tools that you're going to use here? It's the same tools as you get on the cars section. And I didn't edit my slide. That should have said one of the SIRS test tools. But what are some of the tools you had on cars from the guys that were here last time? You get your scratch board, shortcuts, all the keyboard shortcuts, which are highlighting, strikeout, flag, navigate, previous, next. And on the science sections, you get the very, very important, by the way, periodic table. Learn that additional key shortcut keyboard shortcut, Alt-T to get the periodic table to come up. It does not jump up when you need it. You have to remember that you have a periodic table. You do not get a calculator. Let me repeat that. You do not get a calculator. Then you do, yes, you get your scratch board and a wet erase marker. You get noise reduction headphones. You have sealed, you can use the sealed foam earplugs that they will investigate, and you probably will need a mask. I can't imagine them doing away with that rule right now. And then you get the timer, of course. I'm not sure what that symbol means, but it looks like it might be somebody crying, Celestia. Is that about my comment that you don't get a calculator? Well, then you just have to learn that there's not really complex math on the MCAT. It's true. They don't do anything that can't be done by quick estimation. You have to let go of being precise and just be accurate. And again, I think that's a thing that hurts students these days, because like, how many people have done this on this test question? You answered a question and you're like, right, 5.337259123. Does the teacher really want the point, blah, 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 blah? Are those significant figures? Nope. Those are useless figures, and you got to let go of those things. Nobody cares. All you got to do is round. And I know rounding is something that's difficult if you've never done it. So you have to learn how to do rounding. And we'll talk about how to do some rounding in one of our later sessions. MCAT math is a different beastie. You do not need a calculator to do it. Now, what is scientific reasoning? The capacity to understand scientific information and solve problems with logical thinking. Really, it's that logical thinking thing that's the key. And again, there's some similar things like what I said with cars. You have to be able to decode, you have to be fluent in the scientific jargon in this case, in scientific vocabulary, and even still, sentence construction and cohesion makes a difference. Because if you don't understand why they put this before that, like timing in a sentence, then it's going to be hard to understand why they did an experiment in a certain way. So you still have to be able to read fluently in the science section. Now, how many people here are in research groups? Currently. I wish it were more. I really wish it were more. The reason why I wish it were more is because, Celestia, you have something that other people don't necessarily have access to. Because I would say in your research group, you probably have group meetings, and in those group meetings from time to time, somebody presents a research paper. Does that sound like something you guys do? Or it's possible Celestia had a check mark before I answered that question and stepped away. But if you're in a research group, that's something I would ask your professor if you could do, is present a research paper. What you could do is in your circle of MCAT people, or even DAT and OAT, because they need this practice as well, is download the latest edition on the firewall to the, you got to get like the firewall, not the firewall, what do they call those things? To the library. Yeah, yeah. Hop on the VPN to the library, download the latest issue of Science, the journal Science, and pull an article and discuss it. Like everybody, like make a reading group with your MCAT cohort and sit down, read the article and discuss it, because that's how you get better at decoding and getting more fluent with that scientific jargon. It's hard to get better at reading unless you actually do reading of the correct stuff. Science is a good example. Nature is another good journal that you can use for that. The Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, that's another good journal because they pull a lot of articles from those three types of journals to make passages. If you get better at reading those things and understanding it and look at the figures, you get better at the MCAT all the way around. And then again, just like I said with cars, you've got to have the ability to ask these questions. And here the questions are a little different. You're still going to say, what does that sentence mean? But like, ask yourself, why did they do that experiment? What was the reason for that experiment? Or what is that concept they're describing? They describe, oh, that's centripetal motion. Or how does the text tie in with what I know? That's contradictory, or that goes with what I know. What do the figures tell me? And my favorite question, number 7, what is weird about question number 7? What's weird about question number 7? It's actually harder for most people to figure out what the table is, or figure in tables are not telling you, than to figure out what they are telling you. In fact, we often will overinterpret the figure to tell us things that it doesn't say. So very complicated figures don't necessarily have tons of information in them. Well, most of the time, it might say only a couple things, and the rest of it saying, no, I can't describe this. So you have to really ask yourself that question more often than what do the figures tell me. You should be asking, what is the figure not able to tell me? What is it not doing? How many people here believe that they're not great at looking at figures and understanding the figure? Yeah, that's what I thought. More than half, probably more than that. Figures intimidate. Figures are hard things for people to grasp because usually you're not taught how to understand them. That's why, guess what? We have a whole session on interpreting figures, and we're going to spend some time on what not to look for in a figure, how to figure out what's not there as well. So last question I'm going to ask you guys is, what do you guys think are going to be barriers towards you understanding what's going on in a SIRS passage? What do you guys feel is the hardest thing for you guys to do? Memorization? Yeah, like I think that more is akin to like not understanding the content that's in there, knowing what's important and what's not. And I will say that more often than not, there's plenty of useless information. Like there's more useless information usually than there is useful information. You have to learn how to dig past all that crap and go right to the important stuff. Timing, yes. You got to balance that timing with a lot of things. Analyzing it without reading it. That is a thing that we have to learn how to do. The nice thing about that is science, it's a lot easier to tell when they're giving you something important. They tend to put things in quotes and they italicize a lot more than they do in cars, or they'll do abbreviations. You know, if it's abbreviated, they're going to refer to it a lot. Those are important things. So it's easier a lot of times in sciences to pick up on the telltale signs. Just straight up knowing what it's trying to say. That is a chore too. And that, I think, again, it comes from fluency, like having read enough to actually recognize what they're saying without them saying it explicitly. So all these things they're tricky. This is not easy stuff, for sure. So that's what we're going to end today. Our next session, our next 2 sessions are going to be on attacking the question types. So our next car session is not next Tuesday, but July 13th. Our next science session is going to be July 15th. Both of them are going to be about the different types of questions you're going to see in the different types of passages. And we're going to start digging to actual questions. We're going to answer some actual questions during both those sessions. So these first 2 have been just informational, just get you familiarized with what to expect, how you might prepare, how you might study. Now we're going to start hitting the ground and start digging in and tearing some questions a new one. We'll look at a way to eliminate with cars next week, and we'll look at a way to eliminate with science, not next week, the following week. And then don't forget, we have mock test coming up. You cannot sign up for the mock test just yet. It will be available next week for you to sign up. Drop-ins are, as always, Mondays, 8 to noon, although I'm not doing it next week because yet again, we have another Monday holiday. So enjoy your 3-day weekend. And then always you can schedule another session with me, at the website, or you can see what other stuff is going to be happening at hpa.ucdavis.edu/testprep. Well, there'll be another mock test date on another date, not this quarter. No, we have one mock test date, and that's July. We only do one on a quarter. Is there anything we do now to practice skimming the passages in 1 minute? That actually, what I was suggesting the reading passages is reading journal articles is to become more familiar with the way they structure the things, so it becomes easier to find stuff fast. So yeah, I think in general, just getting better at reading, like reading scientific journal articles. JAMA is a good source. Nature and Science. Also +1 PL. Let me put that in the chat box. There's PLOS1, Nature, Science, and JAMA. They get a lot of feedback. A lot of journal articles are subjects of passages from those journals. The recorded sessions will end up being on our YouTube channel. So be watching that. I'll post them up on the main. I'll post links to them up on the Test Prep 102 pages when they get loaded up. That's a good point, actually, Genesis. I misspoke on the time. The first day it was listed as 8 to 4. We're actually doing it 9 to 5 this week, or this year, this summer, the summer quarter. So yes, it's 9 to 5. Yep. I usually like to start at 8, but we're trying something new. So, any other questions? These are all good questions. And is it JAMA or is it JAMA? Like, is it pajama or pajama? Always wondered that, how people pronounce that. I always call it JAMA. All righty, seems there's no other questions. So why don't we call it a day? Have a good long weekend. Oh, there is one more question. Is there a way to prepare myself for the 8-hour mock? My endurance is bad. By taking many of them, Celestia. The more practice tests you do, the more your endurance will build. And that's why I suggest everybody takes 10 practice tests in their time of prepping for the MCAT. The slides, if you want them, you can always email me to get the slides. All righty. Have a good night, everybody. I shall see you in 2 weeks for some more cards.